So this is our communicating through change session. And what we're going to be doing today is spending the next half an hour breaking down what's going on in the world. And it's been a really big couple of weeks. There is a lot going on for all of us. There's a lot going on for our families, our organizations, our teams. There's a lot of worry in the air. And so we're all in it together. We're going to spend the next half hour talking about the best ways to work, the best ways to connect in this time of really massive change. And these are the faces that you're going to hear talking during the session today. My name is Ali and I am the CX Director at Isentia. And we've also got a couple of special guests today as well. We've got Katherine Newtown, who is the CEO of Are You OK? And you'll probably best know Are You OK for Are You OK Day, which is an absolutely massive event. But so what Are You OK are focused on is they're a suicide prevention charity in Australia. And Katherine was telling me some stats about her organisation, which is pretty massive. In 2019, 87% of Australians were aware of Are You OK? And 1 in 4 Australians took part in some kind of Are You OK activity throughout the year. And Katherine's going to spend some time today talking about the best ways to stay connected with your teams, your families, your friends, your workmates in a time of massive change, massive upheaval, and a time of massive worry for a lot of us as well. And we've also got Andrew Ledovskikh. So Andrew is our ANZ Insights Specialist. And what he does is he works with clients to understand news cycles, crises. So this is probably a pretty big one of those. And the impacts that that can have on a brand or a business or an organization. So that's who we're going to be talking to today. And we do have time for questions at the end. So if there's something really interesting that you'd like to expand a little bit more on, or you'd like to know some more from these experts, you can just pop that question in the chat area in the control panel. Awesome. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to Andrew. And Andrew's going to talk about COVID-19 and the way that has been discussed in the media over the last couple of weeks. It's been absolutely massive. And I'm going to hand over to you, Andrew, if you are all ready to go.
Yeah, thanks, Ali. All right. Yeah, my name is Andrew. I work with the Insights team. I'm not sure if all of you have ever had a run-in with the Insights team. We kind of do the analysis in the background. We write reports. We look at the data as a whole, and we look at the media environment as a whole. And for specific clients, we look at a story from start to finish. We're not looking at individual articles. We're looking at how a narrative is developing, what kind of messages are growing out of there. And we try to understand the context around an issue. And we have very limited time here, so I'm going to talk about just some of those broader contexts and just a couple of issues with that brands have to look out for, and I guess why we can't be too complacent at the moment. So the first thing I want to look at is from a Global Web Index poll. We found it was a global poll, and it had some Australian stats in there. In general, they found a significant increase in the amount of news coverage consumed. In Australia, that was 42% said that they increased how much news coverage they consumed, and 26% said they significantly increased how much news coverage they consumed. Those are pretty massive figures, and it shows the importance role that traditional media is playing right now in terms of getting information out there. And people are really, really keen to get information. About 15% said that they didn't feel like they had enough medical info. About 20% didn't feel like they could see what the plan was or understand what the plan was. So traditional media plays that role, talking about macroeconomic impacts, talking about government responses and policies, and they can really dig into those issues. And so this is really a time when traditional media will shine in terms of increased consumption, but also in terms of increased coverage. Now, if we just go to the next slide, when we took a look at the entire media environment, so everything that we track, and we took a look to see how many times COVID-19 or some variation thereof was mentioned, it came out as 27% of all coverage. Now, that might not seem a very impressive figure for the average person, but for analysts like us, that is an extremely interesting figure. Again, we deal with the wider context, and we look at the wider media environment, and that is an unprecedented figure to some extent. You can see that in part, not just from that top line figure, but if we go to the next slide, you can see that in part by looking at specific shows, because within that 27% average, you have certain shows like morning news and breakfast shows with 55% of their clips mentioning the coronavirus. You can also see that with individual topics. So things like sport, the AFL in that week between March 11th to March 17th, 70% of all coverage mentioned the coronavirus. For the NRL, it was 60%. For cricket, it was 50%. So you see that this issue is a vacuum for coverage. It's taking in not only discussion about quarantines and health and economic impact, but it is absorbing all these other issues and it's absorbing all this conversation. The main thing to look at when you look at context, and this is why straight away for us, 27% jumped out at us, is if we go to the next slide. Some of you might remember, it might seem like a distant memory almost now, but the bushfires was a massive story in Australia. It's at the time it was just the story. But even in its biggest week, it accounted for only 16% of media coverage. So that 27%, and it's still rising. In the most recent this week's figures, we're expecting it to come out at about closer to 30%. That 27% represents a massive amount of the media environment. It is almost probably twice as big now as bushfires at its absolute peak in terms of Australian and New Zealand coverage, or Australian coverage in this instance. There are a couple other things that need to be understood in terms of what that 27% figure is. When we look at, sorry, we've probably gone forward a little bit too soon, but when we look at that 27% figure, we still have to remember that there's so many things that cannot talk about coronavirus. The new media is very much putting a lens of coronavirus over pretty much every conversation where possible. But things like weather, individual criminal incidents, you just can't actually talk about coronavirus. So that figure of how much of that discretionary media is being sucked up by coronavirus story is probably a lot higher. The other thing is it's very difficult to actually start tracking coronavirus. When you look at a narrative and how it develops over time, say climate change, for example, early on in a narrative, you get this nascent period where a lot of the time is spent actually explaining what the issue is. So early on in coronavirus, they would be explaining what the virus is, where it originated, how it was developing, what responses were, but they were specifically talking about it, thinking that the audience had to be explained. As the topic generally, like climate change, becomes more mature, you stop having to actually explain it. So right now, I could write an article just saying, with climate change on the horizon, we need to do this. And I assume that my audience understands what I mean when I say climate change. I assume that they know what the impacts are likely to be, what the issue is, and where we are with it. Coronavirus has hit an unprecedented level of maturity compared to something like bushfires. What we've seen an increasing number of articles that talk about the impacts and issues surrounding coronavirus without actually mentioning coronavirus at all, implying that journalists think that the topic is so front of mind that audiences will just understand what they mean. We saw, for example, a whole number of stories about sporting leagues talking about shortened seasons and delayed starts, without ever actually mentioning any of the major keywords surrounding coronavirus. So that number, again, isn't fully representative of all conversations that are being had around coronavirus, because this story is not only being talked a lot about directly, but it is layering context over every other conversation that we're having. Now, the one thing I would note when we talk about that and that difficulty with keywords is that for any of you who are doing your own searches, who are doing your own research, who are trying to understand those conversations, I'd be very careful about keeping your finger on the pulse about what keywords are being used. There's many articles where people might talk about self-isolation and might not actually mention the coronavirus, particularly shorter articles, particularly shorter TV clips. So if you're doing your own searches, note that this issue is so mature that they don't actually need to say what they're talking about every time. The other thing I would say about this, and now we can probably go to the next slide, is that it is a constantly developing issue. There are so many angles to it. Over the last month, several months, we've seen that economic impact has steadily been on the rise in terms of how much it makes up of that conversation. As we're seeing more and more government policies that are locking down businesses, more and more of that conversation is being increasingly around economic impact. More and more of the conversation is increasingly about government responses and comparing government responses and assessing government responses. Early on, between January to late February, we were seeing mostly discussion about quarantines, about the health impacts, explaining the virus and how it works and how it spreads. Now we're seeing more and more people talking about the nitty-gritty, the macroeconomic impact, the analysis of policy, the assessment of policy, criticism and praise, how we rate up and what we should or shouldn't be doing. You also see, for example, when you look at the business leaders that are being discussed from between the 9th and the 15th of March, we saw pretty much the top 10 business leaders were all in sports and air travel. These were the major issues. We were seeing delayed seasons, we were seeing canceled sporting seasons, and these were the people that had to kind of front up to the media and explain their decisions. They had to balance their economic needs versus the health and safety of their players and their fans, and they had to get in front of the media and really kind of address that crisis. Air travel was the same thing, explaining the economic impacts that were going to be had because of travel bans and lockdowns. Now we're seeing slowly banks are starting to filter into that conversation. Aged care is starting to filter into that conversation. And we're going to see it keep developing. So another point that is really important to raise is that more and more industries are going to be dragged into this conversation. There's only so much room in that media conversation that very often you are going to have it be drowned out with what is the biggest story at the moment. But more as this issue continues to develop, as the angles continue to grow, you're going to see more businesses come in, and more of your brands might actually come under scrutiny and have to kind of take a look at that issue. So there's no time for complacency. It's a big story. I've seen a lot of analysts out there from a variety of institutions talking about media saturation, talking really confidently about where the story is. I would say that it is definitely a very volatile situation. It can change week to week. And there's no guarantee that media cap has actually capped out. It's also a very difficult one to track, and if anyone is having any issues with that, I'd encourage you to contact us, and we can give you some advice around how to look at it and how to understand that coverage. Now, while traditional media, as we just said now, is looking at economic impact, the things that they're good at, and assessing macroeconomic impact, bringing in experts to talk about, how we're faring, how we expect to fare in the future. Social media, I guess, has two differences. So if we go to the next slide, social media has two kind of main characteristics that are really obvious the moment that you compare a conversation on traditional media to social media. And the first thing that you'll notice is that it's often very polarized, in fact, generally quite much more negative. The other thing that you notice is that obviously the conversations are much more personal. To a large extent, those conversations focus much more on the personal aspect of the story. So here we see, for example, an index of the measurement of the word or a conversation around recession versus personal economic impact. You can see that the growth is about 3 times the trend line is about 3 times as high in terms of increases in conversation about job losses, about paying bills, about paying mortgage. If we go to the next slide, we can see that government response conversation, while a very strong point of conversation on social media, is growing very slowly compared to self-isolation, discussions of how people are dealing with it, the strategies that they're undertaking to look at that, the strategies to take how they're looking at that conversation. How they're dealing with the changes, how they're working from home, and outreach of community. But also there is an extreme amount of cynicism about the way that other people are dealing with it. And it's something the brands should be very much aware of. At the moment, sentiment towards brands is actually quite strong there. People are quite happy with the way that governments and large corporations and businesses are responding. Not uniform opinion, but net positive. The main source of criticism is how other people are dealing with it. And that is something to watch out for. Although it doesn't necessarily impact brands directly at the moment, it shows that there is still some skepticism, some fear, and some willingness to kind of point fingers during this crisis. And if your brand isn't careful, if your brand becomes fronts the media and doesn't answer appropriately or doesn't get its policies in order, it can still become the target of a very negative response, even if it hasn't up to now. Sorry, I'm going to have to cut it off there. I had a few more things to say, but we can address them later.
Thank you, Andrew. That was fascinating. So much data and so much talking about things on a really broad level and how things are playing out differently in traditional and social. I'm sure we're going to have some questions for you at the end. But what I want to do now is throw over to Katherine Newtown, who is the CEO of Are You OK? Katherine has been working in this sector for a while, for 10 years, I think she told me. Before she transitioned over professionally, she was a Lifeline phone counsellor. So this idea of staying connected, we're all in this together, how can we support each other, is something that's really dear to her. And I know that for me as a manager, for me as someone as part of an extended team, I've been thinking a lot, how can I make sure that my team is as okay as possible in a really crazy, wild time at the moment. So Katherine, I'm going to throw to you for your tips. That would be amazing.
Thank you very much, Ali, and hello to everybody out there today. I have started to add on another word to our phrase, are you okay today? Because I think it's really important that we reflect and take a moment to think about how we are feeling today, how we're asking other people how we're feeling today with everything that's changing. And I do really encourage you to consider the phrase, are you okay, in a really meaningful way. Are you okay works best when there is trust between a family member, a friend, or a colleague, or a neighbour. Gavin Larkin was a gentleman who started Are You OK? Sadly, his father took his life, and Gavin wanted to do something to help other families not feel that devastating pain that his did. Are You OK? Was born in 2009, so now a decade in, we're really seeing that behaviour change starting to happen. We're hearing that people, communities, industries are coming together to say, this is really important. This is important that we're looking after one another because we all go through life's ups and downs. Suicide, mental illness, life challenges, they affect all of us. It's for every demographic, every age, no matter who you are, what you do, where you come from. It's something that as humans, we're going to have a time where we're not okay. And what our job is health promotion. So we're a very small team. We're a very small team of 8 full-time staff and 4 part-time staff in Sydney. And our job is to make sure that we're getting the message out there in a variety of ways, whether that's via media, whether that's in schools, whether that's in workplaces. Digitally, we have free resources. We have an ambassador program, which is where wonderful volunteers share their lived experiences of either how an Are You OK conversation changed or indeed saved their life. And we also do a lot of free printed resources, and we go out into community, we get into the road, and we connect communities with local support services. Because how we fit in the suicide prevention and mental health sector is that we're about starting that conversation. We're about getting in early, getting into that prevention space. Trust in the signs that you're seeing when you think someone's not quite themselves, they're behaving a little bit out of the norm. Trust in that gut feel where you think, that's not quite right for them. I know they've got something going on, or I'm not sure this is really unusual. I'm going to ask the question. So in a time right now when many people are not okay, and there are many, many signs for us all to see that we're not traveling in the way that we normally would. Our message to you is to absolutely stay connected. We're being told to socially distance, but that's not great for our physical and mental health. Numerous studies, including those from the Black Dog Institute, tell us that. So what we're encouraging the narrative to be is it's about physical distancing with social connections. So whilst, of course, there are things that we can't do anymore, we can't go to gyms, we can't go out to restaurants. For those who don't normally socialise like that, it's different. They can't have their carers dropping in. They can't have their people who normally help with their day-to-day life popping in. But what we can do is encourage everyone to be sensible and to, for example, you can connect with people over a balcony, over a fence if you're at home. in the workplace a bit difficult. So my advice to workplaces is to really encourage the face-to-face, or what we're calling now screen-to-screen meetings. I think there's nothing better than seeing your team, particularly as leaders. There's nothing better than to actually see your team and how they're faring. Many people are going to be feeling a heightened sense of anxiety, loneliness, fear, family pressures and financial pressures, as we all know, the incredible job losses all around us. And all of these things really escalate, and the ramifications of mental illness and other socioeconomic issues related, really we're going to see a lot of changes there. But we can look after each other. We can stay connected. We're in this together, as Ali said. I think one of the most important things that we can do when we do see that face-to-face connection or that phone call is to make sure that we're communicating clearly and that we're being transparent, and 100% to make time for the other person. Right now, many people just want to talk. They need to vent. They need to get off what's on their chest. Many of us are going to sleep at night with thoughts running around in our minds. Sometimes it can be all someone needs, to just be heard, to just listen. And that's the second step to our conversation guides. First is to ask in a meaningful way, and the second is to listen. The next step is to provide some support, encourage them to take some action. Now, what might that be? So if we're thinking about our teams, that could be, what can I do for you right now? How's your home environment set up? How is this communication working for you? Do you need to talk more, or do you need to talk less? What's happening in terms of your team projects? Where are the hurdles coming up that you might not have expected? And then, of course, to share with your colleagues and your friends and families, remind them of this, of the supports that are available. So hopefully many of your organisations have EAPs, which is the Employment Assistance Program. Now, those programs are there for a reason. They're there for you to access, and they are entirely confidential. I can guarantee you that when you use an EAP, your boss doesn't know who's used it and why they've used it. It's just simply a bill that comes through. And so when you've got supports like that, your wellbeing champions, connecting with them, peer support is such a crucial factor in terms of helping people feel like they connect and belong when they're experiencing a life challenge. Really encourage everyone to understand that it's okay to not be okay. Show vulnerability. We're humans, it happens, and particularly as managers and leaders, it can be really important to show that vulnerability and to share how you're feeling, to let your team know that it's okay to talk about this. There is no stigma and there is no judgment. What I'm hoping to see in the months to come is that there's a greater level of understanding for conditions like anxiety, like depression, because whilst, of course, many people, 1 in 5 Australians live with a mental illness, 1 in 2 people will experience some form of mental health challenge in their life, and naturally that number's going to go up after this, but hopefully we can really start to shift that dial on the stigma front. Really easy things to do for yourselves: take breaks. I know we've just been talking about the media, but try to limit your media intake, get your information from trusted sources, have those breaks. We can still exercise, we can still do home workouts, we can still go for walks and runs. Sleep. Sleep is really important. Try to really get some good rest to allow your brain to process everything right now. And routine. We're human beings, we're social animals, we love a routine whether we realise it or not. And you know, Ali, what I would sign off with here is something that's really, you know, occurred to me is to, you know, to think about how you want, you know, how you want to get through this and how you want to be seen to get through this. And I think that being ourselves, being kind, and staying connected with people to let them know that if you are well and able, that you can be a listening ear, and I'm now saying a virtual shoulder to lean on, then it's something that if we stay connected, we can really help others get through this. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Katherine. What resonated with me the most was the bit about how people just need to talk. I feel like I've spent more time on the phone in the last 2 weeks than I have in years and years. And it's true, we just all need to find different ways to talk to each other. So we've got another 2 official minutes on the clock, but we might be able to stay a little bit longer. Now is a time for questions. So if you do have a question, the best way to ask that is by typing that into the chat area, and I'll keep an eye on those. While those questions come through, Katherine, I just wanted to ask you something. Often maybe when you are having one of those days where you're not okay, which is okay, we're encouraged to get in touch with someone like Beyond Blue or Lifeline, but we're also hearing so much at the moment about how we're physically distancing to flatten the curve. Are those the kind of charities or services or support systems that we should also be trying to not overload?
Absolutely not. No, the services, of course, are increasing demand at the moment, but they're there for us. That's what they're there to do. Please, no one be afraid to call on Lifeline 13 11 14, to head to Beyond Blue. They've got phone support. They've also got an online forum dedicated to COVID-19. For young people, there's Headspace and there's Reach Out. I fully appreciate that people might be worried about, oh, you know, I'm not feeling that bad, so I don't really need to be thinking about picking up the phone or heading online, so I don't want to bother anyone. But honestly, this is where we really need these services to be funded with full workforces, and they're going through their changes at the moment to move to remote workforces. They're there, they're supported, the Department of Health are helping, so please call on them.
Awesome. We've got another question that's come through from Patrick. What are the key messages in staff newsletters right now?
I think stay connected, lead with that line, staying connected. Here's how you can physically distance with social connections. So here is why we as a workforce think it's important for you to be doing these things to look after yourself, and how we would suggest that you're communicating as teams. And here is where you can go if you're not feeling okay or you're worried that somebody else might not be okay. Include the helpline numbers that I've just mentioned, include your EAP, and encourage people to talk to a manager, or if they don't trust that person, to speak to another colleague.
Awesome. What have you been doing, Katherine, to stay connected with your team? I know you said you've got a small team, but do you have any good tips for everybody?
Yes, well, we've always had a weekly whip on a Tuesday, so there's no change to that. Always at 9:30 on a Tuesday, so that's now on video call. We're opening up the meeting to talk about how we're feeling in this week, and we're working on small milestones. So I think it's important right now to recognise that, of course, we need to look ahead. We need to think about our budgets. We need to think about our resourcing. But right now, for my team in particular, I'm looking to Easter. So I'm saying that this is our milestone. When we get to Easter, we'll agree as a team on another milestone. And so I'm finding that that's giving people just a sense of calm and a sense of, okay, I don't have to have all the answers right now. And particularly, for our team, it's that we want to do everything. We want to talk, we are mass population campaign, and then we have targeted settings, for example, industries, and then vulnerable at-risk communities. We want to get to everyone. We want to help everyone. But it's a case of saying, I can't do everything in 1 week. I can't do everything in 1 day. This is an unsettling time. We don't have to do everything at once. Let's just plan and take it a day at a time.
Awesome. Thank you. This in about an hour's time, because I'm on Sydney time, I know we've got some New Zealand people. My team's going to be doing remote team drinks. So that might not necessarily work for everybody, but that's what we're doing. So this one coming in from Neve, this is a question for Andrew. Why do you think there is such a high percentage of COVID-19 media coverage in the morning and breakfast shows?
Yeah, so we suspect that the morning and breakfast shows are a lot more responsive to I guess, consumer demand. There's still a sense of responsibility from a lot of press outlets we see in particular to cover a range of stories. usually what we're seeing is that in press outlets, we're still seeing quite a lot of stories about other things. For example, the recent cancelling of the moratorium on the onshore gas exploration in Victoria. This was a big announcement, but it did get pushed to about page 13, 14. The breakfast shows seem to be far more responsive to the kind of the finger on the pulse. This is the key issue. This is what we're going to talk about because that's what people care about. So we're seeing probably higher rates on those shows because they know that this is the #1 thing that people care about, and lower rates probably in other outlets, particularly something like The Age or The Australian, where they still feel a responsibility that they should report on, financial news, on other major policy issues, et cetera, et cetera. So we think that it's a higher rate on those because of that.
Awesome. I was just typing into the chat area that we'll do one more question if anybody has one. So if anyone is furiously typing away at the moment, now is your chance to talk to Katherine or Andrew. I feel like we could probably keep talking. There's so much to talk about at the moment, but we're going to do this every single week. So, or at least every single week for the time being. We'll switch it up at some point, but right now connecting like this and chatting feels really important. So I just saw a question come through, which is a really good one, and I'd quite like to know the answer to this as well. And I'm also aware that we've got this really detailed media analysis today talking about social media, but then we're also hearing this message, how do we mitigate digital overload? So Katherine, how would you answer that question coming through from Trish?
I think it's about checking in with yourself in terms of what you need, but I think it's about coming together as your comms team to say what's actually going to get cut through right now. What do we need? What do we need to focus on? I think that, for example, our social media, we know that people want to see positivity. So we know that that whilst we can give the health information lines, etc., and that trusted source of fact, it's actually that they want to be told of other positive good news. And I think that, with such a digital overload, as you've quite rightly said, Trish, I think it's about asking how you want to be communicated to and how as a team you want to communicate. I'm hoping that's making sense. So for example, we've agreed as a team that a video call on a Tuesday is good. We discussed, do we need one on a Thursday? No, because people just want to get on with their job. For example, some of the team are using Microsoft Teams for instant messenger. I personally don't like that, so I've let my team know to say if you do want me urgently, then send a text. I know that's easy because we're a small team, and I appreciate that other workplaces might not have that, but I think it is about that communication amongst you to say, this is what's best for me, how can we do this in the best way, and absolutely take breaks. I'm not sure about any of you, but I've had a couple of 12-hour days locked into my phone and FaceTime, and my sleep is certainly being affected. So I think it's really important that we think about that for how long we're on our devices, and to really try to get that routine and breaks in there. I hope that helps, Trish.
It's tricky, isn't it? It's hard knowing at the end of the day when, it's hard enough to switch off, but when all of a sudden you are working at your kitchen table, like I have been for the last couple of weeks, it's awfully easily to sit back down at that desk when it's right there. And that kind of segues me on to our last point, which is, one, I'm wondering if these webinars need to be a little bit longer. So if you've got feedback on that, let me know, because we're all adjusting to this together. We thought that maybe 30 minutes would be good because it would be easy for you to drop in, but it feels like we've got lots to talk about. And that concept of working from home, how do we manage it? How do we do that best? That's what we're going to dive into in a little bit more detail next week. We're going to be joined by Beck Brown from the comms department, who's going to be talking around the best ways of working in this changed environment. So thank you so much for joining us today. I've really enjoyed myself. Everything is really big at the moment, so it's great to come together and hear about ways that we can connect and that we can work together. We're going to send a recording around after this, so if you wanted to flick this onto your colleagues, or I know a couple of people had sound issues at the start, we'll be sending that around, and we'll send around an invite to this session next week as well. Thank you so much, Andrew, for sharing with us, and thank you so much, Katherine, for joining us today. I know I've got lots of things to be thinking about. I might need to start asking my team, is this good for you, the way that we're communicating? So I'm going to add that to my list. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you. Take care, everybody. Have a great weekend.